If you've ever been super fixated on something for a long time, you'll probably understand my fondness for Steelix. I've played Pokemon games my entire life, and Steelix was always one of my favorites. But like 5 years ago, I realized it was definitely my all-time favorite while playing Sword and Shield. Since then, I've collected every single English Steelix card, plus any of the Japanese-only cards, a bunch of Steelix merch. I've used it in virtually every team of every Pokemon game I've played. I've shiny hunted it more times than I can remember. I've used it competitively, and now I'm making an hour-long video about it. I've spent a ton of money and time on this fictional metal snake, and as you can see by the runtime of this video, I'm doing it even more. I'll be talking about every fun fact, detail, specific competitive use, and just everything else about Steelix that I feel like talking about. But first, I need to explain a few things for the rest of this video to make more sense. For those of you that don't know much about competitive Pokemon, there are two distinct styles that people play: Smogon competitive singles and VGC. Competitive singles is the Pokemon that most people are used to, a 1v1 battle with 6 different Pokemon per team. Depending on the generation, there may be varying rules. Some moves or Pokemon may be legal or illegal to use, and the metas are usually vastly different. Each generation has a set amount of tiers, but the main tier in each is overused or OU. Pokemon that are too weak or not being used enough in the OU metagame can drop to the tier below, underused or UU, and so on and so forth for the tiers below it. For Pokemon too powerful for OU, or that are just not fun to play against, they can be banned to the tier above OU, which is Ubers. Box art legendaries are almost always Ubers level Pokemon, if that helps to paint a picture of what these tiers look like. The other style of competitive Pokemon is VGC, which stands for Video Game Championships, which is the official competitive Pokemon format. This format is a doubles battle where you only bring 4 Pokemon from your team of 6, usually referred to as bring 6, pick 4. VGC is a much faster paced format that functions much differently than competitive singles. VGC won't come up too much in this video for reasons you'll soon find out, but hopefully this helps anyone new to competitive Pokemon understand what I'll be talking about. With that out of the way, let's start with Generation 1. Steelix didn't exist yet in Gen 1, nor did the Steel type itself. But Steelix's pre-evolution, Onix, did technically exist. Onix is alright, I think it's just meh. Sorta cool design, but I feel like not enough was done with it to make it stand out a bit more. But a decent amount of other Pokemon from Gen 1 suffer from this as well. Competitively, Onix is terrible. It does boast a defense stat of 160, which is second highest in the game behind Cloyster's 180. You'd think Onix would be a tank based on that defense and how big it is, but that is not the case at all. Onix has a pitiful HP stat of 35, a special stat of only 30, and an attack stat of 45. On screen now you should see a list of Pokemon that have a higher attack stat than Onix, with the most popular comparison that I usually see is being that Oddish has a higher attack stat. The only other stat Onix can sorta use is the 70 base speed it has, which is speedy compared to the majority of other rock and ground types for the most part, but it doesn't outspeed many important things. Onix currently sits in the ZU tier, the lowest official tier in Gen 1, which stands for 0 used. Down in this tier, it's only just alright, landing in the very middle of the December 2023 viability rankings. It's outranked by Pokemon like Pidgeot, Parasect, and Tentacool. It sucks, and if you're playing OU, pretend it does not exist because there is virtually nothing good about using it compared to the other rock ground types. I could talk about what Onix does in the ZU tier, but this video is about Steelix, not Onix, and the faster I stop talking about Onix, the faster I can talk about Steelix. I think Onix ends up being good in Little Cup once Steelix gets introduced, but if it's only good once it was allowed to go beat up children, that really shows how unviable it was. Generation 2 is the first generation that I have a lot to talk about. Gen 2 is one of my favorites, and a majority of my top 10 favorite Pokemon are from Johto, obviously one being Steelix. I also find the sprites in Gen 2 to just be really charming for the most part, and Steelix is no different. The sprite in Gold is pretty good. Steelix looks mostly on model to what it ends up looking like in the later sprites. I say mostly as each of the Gen 2 sprites gives Steelix a differing amount of rock segments on its body. The Gold sprite had 11 segments and the Silver sprite had 13, but Gen 3 onwards, Steelix only has 9. Now the sprite they use in Silver, this is a good sprite. Steelix looks like he knows he's cool. It's the exact type of thing I could see from sprites like this. The back sprite is also really good. I think this is just what it should look like, and they nailed it. And sort of unfortunately, Crystal ended up using the gold sprite instead of the silver one, and they just animated it a little bit. Like I said, it's a good sprite, just not as good as the silver one was. Also, Gen 2 introduced shinies, and Steelix has a really cool one. Pretty simple, just turn the cool metal guy into the valuable metal guy. Making him gold is just a good idea, and I can't say I would have done it any differently. Also, I plan to talk about each of Steelix's sprites whenever we come across a new one. I'll throw these in a tier list to organize it. People still like tier lists, right? The golden crystal sprites are A tier, and silver sprite is S tier. I love it. Most back sprites end up being the same exact thing, so I don't see a point in ranking them, so I'm not going to. Okay, enough about the sprites, back to what Steelix is and what it does. Unsurprisingly, the same way that Onyx is a big rock snake, Steelix is a big steel snake. A 30-foot long, 881-pound snake, in fact. Also, something that I think is pretty funny is that the Pokédex states that Steelix evolves from an Onyx when the Onyx's rock-like skin is compressed into diamonds deep underground. The University of Leicester actually set out to see if this was possible and calculated that it would take 4.5 to 6 gigapascals of energy over the course of billions of years to crush an Onyx into a Steelix that is only a little over 6 centimeters thick and about a meter shorter than an actual Steelix. Steelix changes a lot when evolving from Onyx, dropping the rock typing for a steel typing, but still holds on to the ground typing. Steel and ground typing is just fantastic for a Pokemon like Steelix. Steelix is weak to fighting, ground, fire, and water, but it's neutral to grass and ice. Being weak to fire and fighting type moves isn't great, but they aren't the most common moves in the world until later on. But being weak to ground and water moves is pretty bad no matter which generation you're playing. But for these actually pretty manageable weaknesses, Steelix has a ridiculous 10 resistances along with 2 more immunities on top of that. The 2 immunities being electric and poison is really good, making Steelix one of only a handful of Pokemon that are immune to both Thunder Wave and Toxic. Steelix is also a really good rock resist, as it has a 4 times resistance to rock. And to top off this fantastic defensive typing, Steelix has a gargantuan defense stat of an even 200. Shuckle was also introduced in Gen 2 and has a defense and special defense stat of 230. But Shuckle sucks and I hate him, so Steelix has the highest defense stat that matters. Steelix has a base stat total of 510, and with 200 of that being in its defense, that doesn't leave a crazy large amount for the rest of its stats. When Steelix evolves from Onyx, it gains stats and HP, both physical stats and both special stats, but it loses 30 speed points. Onyx wasn't super fast anyways, so the speed wasn't gonna matter too much. Plus, this means that Steelix got more points in the stats that actually matter. Like I already mentioned, Steelix has 200 defense and 30 speed, but has a usable 75 base HP, 85 attack, 55 special attack, and 65 special defense. The special attack will virtually never matter unless you're just kind of feeling wacky and you're running a special attacking Steelix, but only 85 physical attack is pretty underwhelming. The upside is that due to how bulky Steelix is, it will almost always at least get off 1 or 2 attacks, so it's not the end of the world that it can't really one-shot anything outside of using Explosion. And that brings us to Steelix's moves. Like most early generation Pokemon, Steelix's move pool isn't really that deep, but it kind of gets everything it wants, except for Spikes. Spikes are pretty important, as they are a ground type hazard that can be set up on the enemy team to inflict 12.5% damage on every switch in, unless they're a flying type. Having this move is pretty great for the Pokemon that get it, and Steelix would have been even better with it, possibly being one of the best spike setters in OU if it got it, if not the best. For what moves Steelix actually tends to use, the main set uses Curse, Roar, Earthquake, and Explosion. Explosion can be substituted for Body Slam or Rock Slide for more coverage if needed. Curse and Roar is actually a really good duo of moves on Steelix, as Curse will raise Steelix's attack and defense by 1 stage, and also lower its speed by 1 stage. Steelix is already incredibly slow, so the speed is not noticed. And actually, in Gen 2, the lower speed is helpful. Roar is used on this set as due to Gen 2's mechanics, if both Pokemon use Roar, the faster Pokemon's Roar will fail and the slower one will work. So with some prediction, Steelix can prevent itself from getting phased out by phasing the opponent out on the same turn. Roar also allows Steelix to sit there and just spam Roar to rack up damage from the layer of spikes you have on the field, and it's one of the best Pokemon in the tier at doing this. Earthquake has good base power and is Steelix's main stab move. For those that don't know, stab, or same type attack bonus, is the mechanic where if a Pokemon is the same type as the move it is using, that move will have a 50% boost in base power. So, Steelix's Earthquake effectively has a base power of 150 instead of the regular 100. Steelix doesn't tend to run a Steel-type move for stab, as it doesn't hit as many things for good damage as Ground-type moves do, and most Steel-type moves in Gen 2 aren't the greatest anyways. Steelix's last move is a bit dependent on what you need it to do for your team. I would normally run Explosion, as it can just blast a hole into the opponent's team, but Body Slam or Rock Slide would be better if you aim to stack up Curse Boost and Sweep. Body Slam helps spread some paralysis, and it pairs well with Earthquake, as anything that resists normal is hit hard by Earthquake, with the exception of Ghost types, but considering that Gengar is also Poison type, it gets hit pretty hard. Body Slam isn't aiming to do a huge amount of damage, but to spread status so that your other Pokemon can clean up after Steelix is done. Rock Slide helps to deal with the flying types better, mainly Zapdos, as Steelix can check Zapdos pretty well, unless Zapdos is running Hidden Power Water. Zapdos tends to run Hidden Power Ice to cover ground types, but since Steelix is one of the few ground types not weak to ice, this gives Steelix a pretty good chance of coming in on Zapdos and dealing with it. Skarmory is a tough matchup though for Steelix. It's immune to Earthquake, and it resists both Body Slam and Explosion, and it doesn't really care much about the damage it takes from Rock Slide. If Steelix is running Explosion, it needs to boost up with Curse 4 times to guarantee that Explosion will one-hit KO an unboosted Skarmory. If Skarmory uses Curse 1 time, then Steelix only has a 70% chance to one-hit KO after getting all 6 Curse boosts. So, dealing with Skarmory before trying to sweep or anything with Steelix is pretty important. And even though Steelix has such a gargantuan defense stat and typing, a few Pokemon are able to punch past it. Marowak is one of Gen 2's strongest wall breakers and has a guaranteed 2-hit KO on Steelix with a super effective Earthquake, assuming Steelix hasn't used a Curse Boost yet. Machamp is also able to punch through an unboosted Steelix with Cross Chop, having a little over a 50% chance to 2-hit KO after factoring in leftovers. Machamp and Marowak both can't 2-hit a Steelix with a Curse Boost though, so they usually need to switch on a predicted Steelix and hit it before it can start boosting. Oh, and Steelix's held item is leftovers, just like almost every other Pokemon in this generation. There aren't a ton of good options for held items, so there's not really reason to run anything but leftovers for the most part. And the last thing I want to talk about for Gen 2 is Pokemon Stadium 2. The first Pokemon Stadium game allowed you to do Generation 1 battles in 3D on your N64, along with minigames, tournaments, and a way to play the Gen 1 games on your TV. I played this a lot growing up, but didn't know for a long time that there was a sequel that incorporated the Gen 2 Pokemon. The main thing I want to talk about here is not only that I think this is a cool and fun way to do Gen 2 battles, that Steelix looks really good in this game. Steelix's model is actually really well made, and the steel effect looks surprisingly good for the time. And you've probably noticed that Steelix is floating and spinning around, and I'm not really sure where this idea stemmed from, but I'm all for it. Does it make a ton of sense that Steelix can float? Not really, but it's pretty sick, so I'm cool with it. I actually kind of prefer it over how Steelix normally looks. Steelix's other animations are pretty good too. The boulders with the long pointy stone things, I'm not really sure what to call them, spinning around in different directions at different speeds is a really nice touch. And another detail in Pokemon Stadium 2 is how they interpreted the Pokemon's cries, taking these bit crush sounds and adding a more realistic sound based on the originals. Steelix is a pretty fitting one, and while this doesn't return in later games to my knowledge, it seems like future cries were based off of it a bit. But for everything they did right in Pokemon Stadium 2, they did do one thing wrong that I think was actually pretty cool. Shiny Steelix has these like blue-green eyes instead of red ones. I think this looks really cool with the gold shiny, and it was a neat decision the devs made since Steelix's eyes couldn't actually be seen in-game other than a black pixel. Remember this though, shiny Steelix has blue eyes here. One last little thing, shinies in Gen 2 are calculated based on the Pokemon's stats, and a perfect stat Steelix can't be shiny. So this means that just like it would work in real life, a Steelix made out of gold isn't as tough as one made of steel. I just think it's a funny unintentional detail. And that's it for Gen 2. Overall a great start for Steelix, and based on all of this, it'll definitely stay an OU staple, right? Not really. Now we're in Generation 3, and Steelix has fallen to UUBL. UUBL, or the Underused Ban List, is made up of Pokemon likely too strong for UU, but not consistent enough to be ranked in OU proper. Oh, and by the way, I may use Gen 3 and ADV interchangeably. People tend to call Gen 3 OU ADV OU, as they came out on the Game Boy Advance. So if you see me use either of these, just know that they mean the same thing. Gen 3's UUBL actually has more Pokemon than there are in Gen 3 OU. And this is the largest UUBL in any generation. But there's a reason. Smogon uses usage-based tiering, but that didn't start until Gen 4, so Pokemon were put in UUBL based on higher level players that had experience in the tier voting on where to put them. So many of the Pokemon in UUBL are usable in OU, some less so, but it's pretty agreed that the vast majority of them would probably be too much for UU to handle. Plus, no one that plays Gen 3 UU is looking to have a bunch of Pokemon dropped into that tier and completely changing how that tier plays. But don't get it twisted. Steelix is still a perfectly good choice to use in OU, likely being one of the better UUBL Pokemon. But before I talk about what Steelix does, I need to quickly mention some big changes that Gen 3 brought. Firstly, abilities. Steelix was given two abilities, being Rockhead and Sturdy. Rockhead negates recoil from attacks the user uses, except for Explosion or Self-Destruct, and Sturdy negates one-hit KO moves like Fissure or Sheer Cold. Sturdy eventually becomes a much better ability later on in the games, but in Gen 3 it isn't useful at all since OHKO moves are just straight up banned in Smogon singles. I have a bit more to say about Steelix's abilities, but I'll get to that later in the video. Another huge change made that is a bit more complicated is that the behind the scenes stats for Pokemon received an overhaul. In Gens 1 and 2, each stat had DVs, aka determinant values, and these could range from 0 to 15. In the new system, these are now called IVs, or individual values, and range from 0 to 31 instead. Gens 1 and 2 didn't really have anything differing Pokemon stats, it was mainly just different moves or slightly different DVs for different hidden powers. Now, just like DVs, IVs can be fully maxed out at 31 in each stat, which would allow the highest possible stats for that Pokemon. But Gen 3 introduced EVs to go along with that, aka effort values. EVs allow a Pokemon stat to go even higher than without any EVs. However, they have a maximum of 510 possible EVs on one Pokemon, and a single stat can only have a maximum of 255. Due to the way that EVs work though, you only need 252 to max out a stat, not 255, because at level 100, every 4 EVs equals 1 extra point in that stat. Effectively, only 508 EVs will end up making a difference on a Pokemon. For an example on how this works, I'll show up some damage calculations up on screen, show the difference between not having any IVs or EVs and having maxed out ones. As you can see, having full stats makes an insane difference. So moving forward in every generation, IVs and EVs are a pretty big thing to worry about when setting up your team. Whenever a Pokemon is caught, it will have a random nature specific to that Pokemon to help differentiate them from each other. Some natures do nothing, but the majority will drop 10% of one stat to add another 10% to a different stat. I'm mainly explaining all this because the way the game works now is just vastly different than Gen 1 and 2. And I have to refer to different sets with different EVs and natures differently now. Speaking of, let's start by talking about Steelix's sets. I'm not going to list off the EVs or natures used in each set unless I think it's necessary or vital for that set to function, but for the most part I won't be mentioning it. First off is Steelix's usual walling set, consisting of Earthquake, Toxic, Roar, and Explosion. This set kind of lays the bedrock for every Steelix set moving forward, and that's because it's a pretty good set. As expected, it specs more towards bulk due to Steelix being a bit of a tank, but it also gets a bit of attack. You can also run Hidden Power Rock or Rock Slide for some extra coverage, and Rest if you really need Steelix to be a wall with healing. Chesto Berry on a set with Rest can also work, but you'll usually just opt for Leftovers, and this works even better if you have something that can heal Bell the sleep off. Leftovers is also nice on Steelix, since Sandstorm is so prevalent in ADV due to Tyranitar. Steelix benefits from being immune to it and still getting the healing from Leftovers. This set is good at soaking physical hits and dishing out some admittedly mediocre damage, which is why a lot of the time you'll be running Toxic to pressure non-steel types. The set also appreciates spikes being set up for phasing. Oh yeah, and spikes can be stacked up to 3 layers now. The first layer will still do 12.5%, just like in Gen 2, but having a full 3 spikes will do 25% on switch-in. Steelix loves having spikes up on the other team for the opportunities it gets to pressure things out with Roar or just pure walling. The only thing Steelix would love more than having spike support would be the ability to use the move itself. Kinda crazy how Spikes, a ground type move, was given to Skarmory in Gen 3, but not to Steelix, who is actually a ground type that would benefit massively if it got it. Anyways, the move Block is another possible option for Steelix to run, allowing you to possibly trap a water type that would normally force you out upon switch. This sounds bad, but since this set tends to spec into Steelix's special bulk, since its defensive bulk is already so good, you can usually survive a single water or fire type move and just explode to get a trade. Against other Pokemon that are slow setup sweepers, you could also run Psych Up to attempt to 1v1 them, or just steal the boost and roar them out. Steelix feels like it has more good options this gen than last, and Steelix can be tweaked a lot to fit different teams' different needs. But my personal favorite set is the Choice Band set. The Choice Band is an item that increases physical moves by 1.5 times power, but locks you into whatever move you use until you switch back out. I made a point earlier about Steelix's somewhat lacking attack stat, and a Choice Band does help to remedy this a bit. This set still aims for some bulk, but it definitely specs much more towards attack, and depending on the team, you can just max out your attack and go with an Adamant Nature for the highest attack stat possible with whatever bulk you think is needed. This is the only set where the ability will end up mattering, as picking Rockhead allows you to use Double Edge with no recoil for a good neutral hit on Pokemon like Swampert or other water types switching into you. And as most sets will, this set runs Earthquake and Explosion. Earthquake is just a strong, accurate stab move, and Explosion is a good way for Steelix to trade with something, especially considering Explosion gets a boost from the Choice Band. The other moves are up to you mostly, with different options like either Hidden Power Steel, Hidden Power Rock, Rock Slide, Iron Tail, Double Edge, Hidden Power Bug if you need to hit Celebi, but that's a bit more niche. Since Steelix won't be holding Leftovers on this set, Steelix isn't able to heal up at all, so it appreciates having a Wish support Pokemon. And it can have a much easier time punching holes in the enemy's team if spikes are up and you spread some paralysis. Personally, I play a lot of Gen 3 OU, and I like running a Choice Band Steelix alongside Salamence and Gyarados. Steelix and Gyarados have good synergy, and Gyarados' Intimidate makes it even easier for Steelix to hit the field against physical attackers. Same for Salamence's Intimidate. Salamence and Gyarados both also can't take a Rock Slide amazingly, and Steelix quad resists it, and takes pretty much nothing. I've also seen some other Steelix teams run Steelix alongside Umbreon, but I could never find success with teams like this, so I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I think Steelix is a pretty healthy presence. It's UUBL for a reason, but there are a lot of water types that can threaten it now, and a lot more fire types. 200 base defense on a steel type can just really be that valuable though. Plus, Steelix is helped by not being weak to the Bolt Beam combo, being immune to the now much more common Toxic, and it helps to have a defensive pivot that's really good against Rock Spam. One day, I'll be a high ladder player using Steelix, but for now, I'll hold my position at 1100 points on the ladder, trying to make teams like Steelix plus Lantern plus Houndoom work. Now we have to talk about something I haven't mentioned yet for Gen 3, the sprite. Man, they messed him up. It's such a weird angle and the face just looks off. I can't really tell exactly what it is, but it's probably that they obscured the smile and he just looks kind of bored, not at all what he should look like. Emerald just animates the sprite. I don't really think it helps or harms it. It's just weird to me that they somehow nailed the sprite in Gold, Silver, and Crystal, but they didn't translate it well to the new ones. Oh, and the back sprite is actually pretty good, pretty similar to the one from Gen 2. I'm putting each of these sprites in D tier. I'm really not a fan of these. Just like how Pokemon Stadium 2 was a console battle simulator for Gen 2, Gen 3 also got not one, but two games that can be used for Gen 3 battles. The first was Pokemon Coliseum, and the second is Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. Both of their multiplayer battle modes work the same to my knowledge, and they use the same models from Pokemon Stadium 2 for all Gen 2 and 1 Pokemon. Which is confusing because now regular Steelix's eyes are blue. They were red in Pokemon Stadium 2, so I'm not sure how that ended up getting swapped. But Shiny Steelix also still has the blue eyes in-game. Now the menu icon shows it with the red eyes. Honestly, some of the shinies in this game were made pretty lazily. Like, Shiny Steelix isn't actually a Steelix that's gold, it's just a Steelix with a gold texture overlaid on it. It makes the whites of the eyes and the teeth gold, which it just kind of looks bad. They did change a lot of shinies in these games, so at least Steelix is mainly correct. But shout out to Shiny Scizor in these games. It looks so cool. I liked Scizzor's normal shiny, but they should have gone with this one. It's just better. But hey, at least Shiny Steelix having a different menu icon is a cool touch. Gen 3 was the last generation where Steelix was something you'd see in OU pretty commonly, as it fell to UU in Gen 4. It's not all bad though. There's a new cool hazard move that the meta is shaped around, Stealth Rock. And unlike with Spikes, Steelix actually gets to use Stealth Rock, and it is a fantastic user of it in UU. Stealth Rock sets up a hazard on the opponent's side of the field that deals damage on switch in that's based on that Pokemon's weakness to rock. So fire types, bug types, ice types, and flying types are all pretty hard to use if they don't have a dual type that makes them neutral to rock. Pokemon like Steelix though, that's not an issue at all. Steelix quad resists rock, which means that it's one of the few Pokemon that actually heal with leftovers after switching into Stealth Rock. Stealth Rock deals just over 3% for a quad resistant Pokemon, and leftovers actually heals a little over 6%. Which means Steelix still gets about 3% healing at the end of the turn. Steelix's main walling set makes a return, though this one is a bit different from last time with a few exceptions. This set still invests in Steelix's HP and special defense, as the physical defense is already good enough, and leftovers for passive recovery is going to be the go-to item 99% of the time. Earthquake remains a pretty mandatory stab move, and now Stealth Rock is pretty much a necessity for it as well. Steelix appreciates some of the new moves that were added this generation though. Stone Edge being a more powerful rock slide with a high crit chance, and Gyro Ball. Gyro Ball is a fantastic move for Steelix, as it's finally a good steel type stab that does more damage based on how slow Steelix is compared to whatever it hits, maxing out at 150 base power. Let's not forget, Steelix is really slow. Steelix can get even slower by dropping its speed IV down to 0 and running a nature that lowers speed while raising a different stat. This won't make the base power go above 150 for anything, but it'll give you more Pokemon that you can actually hit for that 150 base power. The final move for this set is another type of whatever fits best move. Toxic or Explosion are both great, and this is the last generation where Explosion is really good, as it stops having the opponent's defense in the damage calculation starting in Gen 5. Roar is also a good option for Steelix to do some phasing. And having access to Roar gives it a role that its UU Stealth Rock setting rival Registeel can't do. Reggie still has Stealth Rock and a better supporting move pool, along with a much better special defense stat than Steelix, which makes it a more popular Stealth Rocker in UU, but it lacks the ability to do much damage or phase out setup sweepers. These moves are pretty much everything you need on the Walling set, but some other coverage exists like Payback, which is meant to hit ghost types harder than Steelix's other moves. However, the way this set can be used varies depending on the team and the partner Steelix has. Steelix is usually a good partner for specially leading Pokemon, as Steelix is so physically bulky, it can be a good pivot on things these special attackers can't handle otherwise. One good partner to Steelix is Slowking, as it pairs well defensively with Steelix and can switch into Pokemon that enjoy switching into a Steelix. Slowking can also spread paralysis to help out Steelix speed-wise, but make sure you drop Gyro Ball on Steelix for something like Iron Head. Gyro Ball loses power since a paralyzed Pokemon gets closer to Steelix's speed, so using Iron Head to para-flinch is much more consistent on a team like this. This is the first generation where Steelix actually has quite a few different viable sets. That Walling set is probably the most common, but there's a similar set referred to as Baitlix. This set makes a lot of sense as Steelix invites in a lot of water and fire types, and that's what this set capitalizes on. The main gimmick here is that instead of leftovers, Steelix will hold either the Aka or Pasho Berry, which halves the damage taken from a super effective fire or water type move respectively. It should go without saying, but Earthquake is on this set, and Explosion is mandatory. Stealth Rock is likely also mandatory depending on your team, and the last move is just whatever coverage you need like normal. My personal go-to would be Stone Edge. The point of this set is to lure in something that would check or beat Steelix with a water or fire type move after Steelix has gotten Stealth Rocks up. Then tank the hit and explode to trade with whatever came in. This can genuinely catch people off guard, especially if they think it's a standard Walling Steelix setting up Stealth Rock, but no leftovers recovery can be a dead giveaway. This set isn't as bulky as the standard set either, though this can be tweaked if needed, but the attack EVs for Explosion really do help. Stone Edge is my preferred last move if you're running the Aka Berry, as this allows Steelix to check Moltres and other flying types. Well, 80% of the time at least. And checking Moltres at all can be really good for Steelix as it's probably your biggest enemy. Aside from Moltres, if you aren't gunning to counter anything else specifically, Iron Head will be better for overall consistent coverage, but it's not as fun as the Rock type gambling button. And speaking of fun, this next set won't allow your opponent to have any. This set runs Torment, which is a move that doesn't allow the opponent to pick the same move twice in a row until they switch out. This is one of the few sets I've seen anywhere that actually runs Substitute on Steelix, but it's for a good reason. With Torment, you can lock an opponent into using a worse move on you or switch, giving you a free turn to Substitute. Once you've got the sub up, you can just Toxic the enemy and then keep hitting them with either Earthquake or Gyro Ball. Personally, I prefer Earthquake to hit the pesky Steel types that are immune to Toxic, but there's always an argument for Gyro Ball. The set is also great at checking Choice Banded Pokemon locked into moves Steelix resists to allow for the free sub. There are other options you can use as well too, like Roar, which can be used to just shuffle Mons around to reveal them and rack up some Stealth Rock damage, assuming you have those up. The way that this set is EV'd leaves it so that a Melodic with 0 special attack investment can't break the Substitute with Ice Beam, giving you a free turn to get a Toxic off on it. Also, the fact that it runs leftovers means that when Steelix heals off the damage from Stealth Rock, the opponent might believe that it's a regular Walling Steelix. The last viable set archetype is a good old Curse set. Curse is ran to be less of a supporting mon and more of a late game win condition, with Gyro Ball and Earthquake being the two attacks you'll want. The last option is customizable as well, with Explosion always being useful on a set where you boost your attack, and Rest can be used for healing. You'll usually use leftovers, but if you're running Rest, you might want to consider a Chesto Berry at least, as this will give you a free full heal the first time you use Rest. Gyro Ball synchronizes well with Curse, as lowering your speed just makes Gyro Ball hit more Pokemon for full power, and your Earthquakes appreciate the attack boost as well. Even though I've only talked about these few sets here, that's not to say that there aren't other viable options to run as well. Choice Band is less effective in the UU meta than it was in OU last generation, but it still has its merits and can't be counted out. And you always have to at least be prepared to get hit with a surprise Thunder Fang or Ice Fang, even though they might not hit too hard. There's also some other niche items that sometimes see use on Steelix, such as the Iron Ball. This halves Steelix's speed stat to make its Gyro Ball hit at the same effectiveness as if it had 2 Curse Boosts, which isn't the best option in the world, but definitely usable on the right team. Shed Skin is technically also an option, but I wouldn't really use it. You get to escape being trapped from the likes of Magneton, but Steelix is already equipped to deal with that usually anyways. I know this was a pretty long section, but Steelix genuinely had great options in UU this generation, and it's really nice to see, honestly. Oh, and about the sprites, Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum did not do anything to rectify the issues I had with Generation 3 sprites. Or, well, they kinda did, as they're just a cleaner rendition of those sprites. Weird thing they did was that in Diamond and Pearl, Steelix's idle sprite had his mouth closed with an animated frame where he opens his mouth. But in Platinum, they reversed it so that the idle frame is the one with the open mouth. I don't really think that works. But hey, the back sprite is actually really good this time around. Also starting in Gen 4, they gave a lot of Pokemon some different features based on gender, and I don't really like what they changed for Steelix specifically. Male Steelix still looks the same as it did, but a female Steelix now only has 1 of the jaw spikes around it instead of 2. It doesn't mess the design up too much, but it definitely doesn't look as cool with just the 1. It just kind of looks off. That's not to say that I don't think that the gender difference is cool, as I think when used well it can make memorable changes, like with Pikachu's tail being a different shape based on gender. And honestly, they could have just like changed Steelix's tail for the difference instead. I'm not sure what I would have done, but I don't know. Something subtle like smaller spikes coming off the sides of the tail or something like that. I just think it's better to add another cool part to a design than try to remove stuff from an already established design that didn't really need changing. Well, visually at least. But who cares about this sprite? Let's take a look at the sprite from Heart Gold and Soul Silver. And yeah, this sprite just nails it. I wish I had more to say, but I think that this sprite is just perfect. It just gets everything right about what I would expect a Steelix to look or act like. The back sprite is the same for the base Gen 4 games, and I've already said I like it, so we get the best of both worlds here. Okay, so the base Gen 4 sprite goes in B tier, and the Heart Gold Soul Silver sprite goes in S tier. That's not actually it for Heart Gold and Soul Silver, as these games famously let you walk around with your Pokemon. And Steelix's walking sprite is really good. It's obviously tiny for how it would be if it were actually made to size, but I don't know, I think I like this little chibi Steelix. And a cool little fun fact about walking with Steelix is that since he's canonically so large, he's on a small list of Pokemon that will return to their Pokeball when you enter a building. This mostly only happens with legendaries, but some other huge Pokemon get the same treatment. Also, while I'm talking about some non-in-battle sprites, the in-menu sprite for Steelix that they used between Gens 3 and 5 is just weird. It gives off the same vibe as someone with no eyebrows, opening their eyes as wide as they can. It's just kind of off-putting. The last thing I want to talk about is Gen 4's Battle Simulator, Pokemon Battle Revolution. They have yet again used Steelix's model from Pokemon 2, but with how angular Steelix's design is already, it still looks alright. I was gonna say that it seems they used the textures from Coliseum and XD since Steelix still has blue eyes, but they definitely didn't for the shiny. This time, it isn't just a golden overlay, it's an actual shiny Steelix that's colored properly. And it has the new red eyes. And finally, shiny Steelix has the correct red eyes. I think this is the last game to get Steelix's eyes wrong, so now I can finally stop yapping about it. It's just crazy to me how they couldn't get both correct over the course of 4 different games. It is still a nice touch that just like in Coliseum and XD, both the non-shiny and shiny have different icons. They even have different icons for the male and female differences, which is pretty cool. Okay, I talked about Gen 4 way more than I expected, so let's just move on. Gen 5 was a great generation for Steelix competitively. But first, let's start with the sprite this time, as this is the final generation to use 2D sprites. But it was actually a great send-off for them, as so many of them are just really good. Steelix's is no different, but it's not good in the way I would have expected. They finally seem to be able to get the right head shape consistently, and this is overall just a great sprite. And it moves. It's pretty funny to me that Steelix is a huge behemoth, slow Pokemon, but he gets a sprite where he's just dancing around back and forth, but I love it. Honestly, I'm not sure what else they would have done, but I also don't really care to think about it since we already have such a great sprite. I mean, just look at him. Also, the back sprite is the only one I'll rank since it's a whole sprite instead of just being only a portion of the Pokemon. It's just as good as the front sprite. I'm putting both in A tier. As for changes Steelix received, we'll start with abilities. Steelix has always had Sturdy since Gen 3, but Sturdy is finally now the ability most people know it for. Now not only are you immune to one-hit KO moves, Sturdy functions as a focus sash if you're at full HP. So, Sturdy Pokemon cannot be one-hit KO'd at all. And unlike the focus sash, which only works one time, Sturdy can be triggered multiple times if you manage to heal back up to full health. This is a genuinely big change for Steelix and all other Pokemon with no better ability than Sturdy, as now you can pretty much get at least one guaranteed move before fainting. Gen 5 also added hidden abilities as a mechanic, and the majority of older Pokemon got one. Steelix can now get Sheer Force, which is a new ability that was added in Gen 5. Sheer Force only comes into effect on moves that can have a positive secondary effect, like Rock Slide's chance to flinch. Sheer Force removes this effect and instead boosts the move's power by 30%. So, Rock Slide can't flinch anymore, but has a base power of 97.5 instead of only 75. And another weird quirk of Sheer Force is that the Life Orb won't inflict any recoil damage on moves that Sheer Force affects while retaining the boost. The Life Orb is an item that was introduced in Gen 4 that boosts damage by 30% at the cost of 10% of your max HP after you land an attack. And this synergizes perfectly with Sheer Force. So, assuming a Rock-type Pokemon with Sheer Force and a Life Orb uses Rock Slide, its 75 base power would become 112.5, then 146.25 with Sheer Force, and then 190.125 base power with the Life Orb. Steelix has always had an issue with not hitting hard enough, so of course there is a set that aims to use the absurd power boost that Sheer Force offers. And this Sheer Force set is a bit bittersweet, as it does hit pretty hard in RU. Yeah, Gen 5 is pretty infamous for some crazy power creep and how lots of OU Pokemon from Gen 4 are now big players in Gen 5 UU. But that's fine. Steelix is actually fantastic in RU. Steelix isn't exactly a niche pick in RU. It's rated an A tier on the most recent viability rankings and is considered to possibly be the best physically defensive wall in the tier. This reputation allows this set to work even better, as the opponent might make a swap expecting a defensive Steelix just to get hit with a beefy Iron Head or Iron Tail. Whichever of those two moves you want comes down to a simple power versus accuracy question, and Crunch is often used for Sheer Force coverage. The set also runs Stealth Rock, as Steelix would feel just kinda incomplete without it, and it can be used to bait people into thinking it's a regular Steelix. You'll still probably want to run Earthquake just because it's such a good move, but you do have to accept the 10% recoil on it since it's unaffected by Sheer Force. And you might be surprised, but Life Orb isn't a necessity on this set. Sometimes having the passive recovery from leftovers is actually more valuable. You can also run Rock Slide to surprise Steelix's previous check from Gen 4 UU, Moltres. My personal favorite part about this set is just how customizable it is. Steelix actually gets a lot of coverage moves that get affected by Sheer Force. You've got Rock Slide, Thunder, Fire, and Ice Fang, Crunch, Iron Head, and Iron Tail. You could also use Stone Edge if you prefer gambling. Then you also have Body Slam, Headbutt, Rock Climb, and more. Not all of these moves will be used consistently, some never at all, honestly, but more options is always better than less. But different choices also applies for the sets, and Sheer Force isn't Steelix's only set. I'm not going to say too much about it, but surprise surprise, Steelix has a defensive wall set again. Once again, you have Stealth Rock, Earthquake, Gyro Ball, and Roar for the same reasons as in Generation 4. Dragon Tail is an alternative for Roar, as it does the same thing while dealing damage, but can't face Pokemon with a substitute, and it's only 90% accurate. Other than that, spec into defense, hold leftovers, same thing, different day. You can also use a rock move if you need coverage for flying types, and Toxic and Rest depending on what you need Steelix to do for your team. Like I mentioned before, Moltres is still a problem for Steelix, but Stealth Rock will deal 50% on switch in, so you might not need to bother running a rock move. Other checks to Steelix can get decimated by Toxic, like Dusk Noir or Tangrowth. The next set actually uses a berry introduced in Generation 4, the Custap Berry. The Custap Berry is similar to other berries in that its effect begins once you're below 1/4 max HP, but the effect is pretty unique. Once knocked into the berry range, your next move will be bumped up a priority bracket. Naturally, the immediate thought is that Steelix is bulky enough to usually live a hit, and it has sturdy, so using this berry is pretty simple. When you remember Steelix has Explosion, you'll probably see where this is going. The set specs towards bulk, and the moveset is pretty much always going to be Stealth Rock, Earthquake, Heavy Slam, and Explosion. The whole point is to switch in on something Steelix can check, set up rocks, deal some damage, and then use a priority explosion to keep up the pace. Steelix normally moves as fast as Molasses, so getting to use a surprise speedy explosion is always a good surprise. And you aren't locked into it either. If you feel like saving Steelix is more worth it, you don't have to explode. With that being said though, this Steelix is better fit on a fast offensive team that just needs a defensive pivot. More times than not, you'll be using that fast explosion. Oh, and Heavy Slam is a new steel type move similar to Gyro Ball, but instead of using speed for the base power calculation, the user's weight is compared against the opponent's. Steelix is a 30-foot long snake made of steel, so it weighing 881 pounds isn't very surprising. Actually, it's kind of surprising that it doesn't weigh more. But yeah, Heavy Slam is used over Gyro Ball due to there being more chances for Steelix to get the full power out of the move, as there's a decent amount of similar speed Pokemon in the tier. The Curse set from Gen 4 is also usable again, with not too much changed. It functions pretty much the same as last time, but with some EV differences for the new meta. It's a bit more niche than other sets, but shouldn't be ruled out, even though the Sheer Force set kinda does this job better, minus the defense boosts. And surprisingly, that's it for Smoke on Singles. Finally, I get to talk about Steelix and VGC. Steelix didn't really have any VGC results, except for one. A player named Adib placed 10th at the 2013 US Nationals using a Steelix that he nicknamed the Full Metal Steelix. The Steelix was running Sheer Force with a Life Orb while also running enough bulk investment to survive some just truly crazy hits. What allowed it to survive these crazy hits though? Well, other than just great physical bulk, Steelix relies on its partner, Gyarados. I've already spoken about Steelix and Gyarados' synergy back in Generation 3, but that still applies here as well. And it being a doubles format is even better now, as you can keep Steelix in while Gyarados swaps out to keep intimidating. For reference on how well Steelix could tank hits after an Intimidate, a Jolly Terrakion using a Fighting Gem to increase its power by 50% a single time could not one-hit KO Steelix with a super effective close combat after being intimidated unless it got a critical hit. And if the Terrakion doesn't have a gem, the close combat is only a 3-hit KO. Note that this Steelix set doesn't have any physical defense EVs at all, just HP and special defense. And it's an offensive Steelix too, so it's getting a few strong hits in while tanking any hit it takes like it was nothing. The set Adib ran was Protect, Ice Fang, Iron Head, and Earthquake. Earthquake synergized well with the 4 ground immunities on his team. Iron Head is good stab sheer force damage, and Ice Fang for some more ice coverage since it just hits so much for super effective damage and gets a sheer force boost. Protect is just good to have in doubles to scout for moves and maybe some mind games. Adib also said that they preferred to keep Steelix healthy rather than risking it, so Protect definitely helps out with that. Steelix also functions very well under Trick Room, so having a plan against teams looking to set up Trick Room is valuable. And Adib could even set up Trick Room himself with Cresselia and set up a light screen to help Steelix's lackluster special defense. This team is just really creative, and Adib even says that the only Pokemon that ticked every box he needed on this team was Steelix. We are so back. And if you're interested in reading Adib's full Nationals write-up, it'll be linked in the description. With that, we will move on to Gen 6. X and Y finally brought Pokemon mainline games into the third dimension, and they're for sure 3D. Listen, I'm not going to sit here and talk about the 3D models being stiff and uninteresting like everyone else does. Not because I disagree, but just because everyone already kind of gets the point. I just agree that they're bland. Steelix is no exception. The model's really good too, which makes it even more sad that the animations for Steelix are just him sitting there. At least they nailed the grin in the face. I'm counting this as a sprite for the sake of the video. This is some D tier stuff. Generation 6 encapsulates Pokemon X and Y along with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. And we'll mainly be talking about the latter as I struggled to find a ton of stuff for the X and Y tiers. But that's fine, as Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were pretty huge for Steelix, because there's a new mechanic called Mega Evolution that was introduced in X and Y. And as you probably know already, Steelix was blessed with one of these Mega Evolutions. Man, I love this thing. Steelix's head gets more sleek, some cool spike things on the front, and a third spike on the side of its mouth. And those crystals that replace the jutting rocks is just such a cool idea, and it's even cooler when you realize that those crystals pushed out the steel that's floating around it now. I think the model still suffers from the stiffness of the 3D games, but just on the design alone, it gets an S tier from me. This is fantastic stuff. The thing is, we now have two different Steelixes to cover. Let's start off first with base Steelix. Steelix is yet again fallen down a tier, now resting in never used, or NU. But it's not all bad, as Steelix is one of, if not the best stealth rocker in the tier. The NU meta has a lot of different Pokemon at the top that Steelix can handle pretty well, which gives it a lot of opportunities to set up stealth rocks. And it's nice that Steelix is so good at this because this is kind of all it has to do. Well, not really. There are some other more team-specific sets, like an updated version of the Pastebin set and a similar one running a Choppleberry for fighting-type hits. A set with Custat Berry is still useful too, and on the Smogon page there are two niche options mentioned near the bottom for other possible sets. One is for a Sheer Force Wind Condition set with Life Orb that runs a Totemize with Iron Head, Earthquake, and another coverage move. And yes, it is pronounced a Totemize and not Automize for some reason. I'll be honest, I don't know a ton of this tier to say how effective this set would be, but it must have some merit to be mentioned. The other niche set is special attacking Steelix. As wrong as that sounds, it seems to be pretty good at catching Pokemon that normally check Steelix off guard. It just seems messed up to me that 55 special attack is actually usable in NU, or anywhere other than Little Cup. In previous generations, Steelix usually wasn't seen in tiers above where it was ranked, but for the first time, Steelix has a Smogon right up for the tier above where it's ranked, in rarely used, or RU. Steelix has a niche being a more defensive ground and steel type than other offerings in the tier, such as Rhyperior, Registeel, and Bronzong. Steel and ground typing allows Steelix to live a bit longer than Rhyperior can, since Rhyperior has to worry about toxic and multiple 4x weaknesses. Steelix can also hit a lot harder than Registeel or Bronzong can, which makes it a good balance of defense and offense comparatively. The issue is that Steelix doesn't do what you would want it to do as a bulky ground type. While compared to the other steel types, Steelix is a better hitter. Compared to the other ground types it competes with, Steelix is a bit of a wimp. All in all, Steelix is still a worthy choice in RU to do the same thing it does in NU, as it's just a good set on a uniquely typed Pokemon. Now I should say that base Steelix used to not see very much play in RU, and that's because Mega Steelix was at one point an RU Pokemon. And from what I can tell, it was absurd. I haven't mentioned the differences between base Steelix and Mega Steelix other than the designs yet, and we'll start with the ability. Mega Steelix gets Sand Force. While there can be a niche to take advantage of this ability, the truth is that Mega Steelix doesn't really care for Sand Force. Solid Rock, Heat Proof, or other abilities like that would have been much better, or honestly even just holding on to Sheer Force or Sturdy. All Megas get 100 extra stat points, and Mega Steelix actually got a pretty good distribution. Mega Steelix still has 75 HP, but it gets a 40-point boost to attack, leaving it with a pretty good 125. Defense is now an astronomical 230, tied for highest defense stat in the series with Mega Aggron and Shuckle. Special attack and speed weren't changed, but special defense got an additional 30 points, leaving it now with a respectable 95. It's honestly kind of surprising that Mega Steelix managed to stay in RU as long as it did, because it was considered to be a bit over-centralizing. Based on the RU viability rankings I could find at the time, Mega Steelix is the #1 Pokemon in the tier, and is one of only 3 in the S tier alongside Tyrantrum and Virizion. Tyrantrum would probably be broken without Mega Steelix to check it, as Steelix resists both Head Smash and Outrage, which are Tyrantrum's 2 main stab moves. Tyrantrum was able to hit back with Earthquake or Superpower, but Steelix's bulk was high enough to stomach at least 1 or 2 hits. I can't find much on the exact sets that would have been used in RU at the time, but assuming they're similar to the current UU sets for each of these guys, Tyrantrum could only hit Mega Steelix for a max of 57.6% with a choice banded superpower. Take into account, this is a 120 base power super effective move boosted by choice band. Superpower does also drop the user's attack by 1 stage after using it, so Tyrantrum couldn't even 2-hit KO Mega Steelix with Superpower without getting a crit. And while we're talking about them, both Tyrantrum and Mega Steelix were banned at the same time with concurrent suspect tests in June of 2016. For those who don't know, a suspect test is used when one or more Pokemon gets suspected in a tier, and at the end of the test, players will vote on whether to keep the Pokemon or ban it. Surprisingly, Tyrantrum actually had more ban votes than Mega Steelix, but both still got a majority to ban. So, after Mega Steelix is banned to RUBL, how did it do? Well, remember how I mentioned Mega Aggron? He's probably the reason that Mega Steelix is a bit outclassed in UU. They both have 230 base defense, but Mega Aggron has 140 base attack and a fantastic defensive ability in Filter. Filter is the same ability as Solid Rock. It just cuts incoming super effective attacks by 25%. Mega Aggron also loses base Aggron's rock typing, so now it's a pure steel type, making it a fantastic wall other than no recovery outside of leftovers. Mega Aggron is ranked solidly UU as it just fits easily onto more teams than Steelix does, but that doesn't mean Mega Steelix doesn't have a niche. Steelix's pre-Mega typing is much better than Aggron's Steel Rock typing, making it a bit easier to get the Mega evolution off safely. Mega Steelix also gets Stab Earthquake, which Mega Aggron is definitely jealous of, and not to mention Mega Steelix's better special bulk and HP. Both Mega Aggron and Steelix use the same tank set of Stealth Rock, Earthquake, Heavy Slam, and either Roar or Toxic, but Aggron also has the useful option of Thunder Wave in this last slot that Steelix doesn't get. Mega Aggron can also be successful with some other options, but this video is about Steelix, so I don't care to talk about that. Overall, a pretty great generation for base Steelix, and while not an OU Titan, Mega Steelix actually had a pretty good start, as this was the first and only time a Steelix has been banned in a tier. Sun and Moon, probably my least favorite mainline games. I don't have much to say about the games or sprites or anything, as this gen just uses the same ones as Gen 6, so we get to skip that this time around. Honestly, not a whole lot to say about base Steelix this time around. It does pretty much the exact same things as last time in both NU and RU. The only real difference in NU is Steelix is more inclined to run Protect instead of Toxic to help it scout choice band users, while also getting some leftovers recovery. NU this time around has gained a few Pokemon from X and Y's RU along with some new Pokemon, so Steelix feels pretty at home since it has dealt with a lot of these threats anyways and has a good matchup against some of the new ones. Steelix was definitely good in NU last time around, but now it's in the S- tier on the most recent viability rankings, giving it a top 5 placement in the tier. As well as NU, Steelix also functions well in RU again, but is definitely more niche this time. Tyrantrum returned to RU this gen, and base Steelix can still check it pretty well, the same way that Mega Steelix did. But Steelix struggles a bit more than it did last generation since there are more specially based threats to deal with. I don't have a ton to talk about this time around, but I do have some stuff to say about Mega Steelix, as he had an even better generation than last time. Mega Steelix is actually ranked in UU this time, and has a really good placing of A- in the tier, which means it's actually got a lot going for it. And this placement is even more surprising when you realize that Mega Steelix actually started off back in RU, but naturally rose to UU in the January 2019 tier shifts due to having enough usage in the tier. And Mega Steelix does really well in UU. It's a really good check to Latias and Mega Altaria, both of which are top 3 Pokemon in the tier. The Steel ground typing still gives it a niche as well when it comes to blocking Volt Turn, which is the combination of Volt Switch and U-Turn on teams, as Steelix is immune to Volt Switch and resists U-Turn. But is sometimes a detriment due to the weaknesses that opens up for electric types that Mega Steelix would otherwise check to take advantage of. This set uses Stealth Rock, Curse, Gyro Ball, and Earthquake. Curse helps Mega Steelix set up for a sweep or to match other boost sweepers so that they don't get to set up for free. And Gyro Ball and Earthquake are just both good stab moves. Same old, same old. Part of what makes Mega Steelix such a good Latias check is that after Stealth Rock's damage, Latias actually gets one hit KO'd with Gyro Ball. For the other moves, the classic move options can still be slotted in where you need them, usually dropping Curse for moves like Rest, Roar, or Toxic. Rest isn't a fantastic idea since you can't carry a Chesto Berry on Mega Steelix, so you'd probably need it for something specific. And yet again, this was a quick generation to talk about. Makes sense though, since a lot of stuff from Gen 6 carried over to Gen 7, and base Steelix kinda just does the same things. Hopefully Gen 8 has a bit more going on. Looking at Gen 8, it does have more for Steelix. Sword and Shield are pretty infamous for cutting a lot of Pokemon from the game, but luckily Steelix managed to stay in. And now with less Pokemon, Steelix managed to jump back up to be RU ranked. Unfortunately though, Megas weren't brought back, so until the new Legends game comes out, we won't be seeing Mega Steelix again. The sprites, or models now I guess, seeing Steelix in full HD is definitely a big improvement over the 3DS sprites. Still a bit stiff though. But in the wild area where you can walk around to find Pokemon, whenever a Steelix spawns, it does the cool floating and spinning that it did in the 3D battle simulators. Genuinely surprised that they brought it back, but I'm really happy about it. It looks so good. 3D Steelix on the Switch gets an A tier. Shout out to whoever made him float again. Anyways, this time around, Steelix is again a bulky Stealth Rock setter running leftovers for healing. What a surprise. The set uses Stealth Rock, Toxic, Earthquake, and Heavy Slam. The choice between Heavy Slam and Gyro Ball is mainly based on the tier you're using Steelix in, which is why so many sets use one and other sets use the other. Steelix also got some new options this time around. Body Press, Head Smash, and Iron Defense. Body Press is a fighting type move that uses the user's defense stat instead of attack stat in the damage calculation, which gives Steelix a fantastic coverage move that it can hit really hard with off that 200 base defense. Iron Defense pairs really well with Body Press as it just adds 2 stages to your defense stat, which effectively doubles it in one turn. Body Press will factor in the defense boost, so with this combo, you're able to just hit some absurd numbers. Head Smash is a rock type move that has a staggering 150 base power, but it's only 80% accurate and deals 50% recoil back to the user. But hey, it's actually usable as Steelix has Rock Head to ignore the recoil, and it would still be a viable move even with the recoil. That 80% accuracy definitely hurts though, unless you're a big fan of gambling. And there's a move that was removed from not only Steelix, but from every Pokemon, Hidden Power. It might sound bad, but Steelix never really used Hidden Power much, and nothing else having the option to just have Hidden Power water or fire or ground coverage that could hit Steelix for a surprise is really good for Steelix. But for the moves it actually wants to use, the ones I already listed have different niches on Steelix. Head Smash can catch flying types off guard that are expecting to come in on a Heavy Slam, and Iron Defense plus Body Press can allow Steelix to become a win condition, sorta like Curse. But having to drop a second move to make room for Iron Defense can definitely be a challenging pick. Roar or even Dragon Tail can be good to phase out setup sweepers, just like always, but using Curse to match boost can also be a viable way to play around other Curse Pokemon, and can even pair with Body Press since you're still raising the defense stat by a stage. Steelix itself is overall a pretty great support Pokemon in RU. It can kind of fit whatever it needs to based on your team. Toxic is always good to just status something to help a teammate break through it later on. There's a decent amount of Fairy and Steel types in RU that Steelix is a pretty solid check to. Steelix does need some support for it to work though, as water types still give it issue like always. So a teammate to absorb those hits like Melodic or Gastrodon is a big help. For the last generation that Steelix has been in so far, it's a pretty solid one down in RU. Oh, and Pokemon Legends Arceus is technically Gen 8, but doesn't have any battling against people, so I don't need to talk about that aspect of it. I just really like the game and Steelix was lucky enough to be in it. There's an Alpha Steelix in the Highlands map. Also, you can just use a Metal Coat directly on Steelix to evolve it instead of trading, which is so nice. I really hope it stays that way, but it probably won't. And that's it for Legends, just a neat game that I really enjoy hunting for shinies in, Steelix included. So you may be asking, what was the point of this video? Well, there were 2 points. Me talking about everything Steelix related that I wanted to, and to see if Steelix was actually good or worth using. So if you're going off an OU perspective, it hasn't been realistically viable since Gen 3, and it was a bit of a one-generation wonder in VGC. But Steelix has always had a place in the lower tiers and has usually been really good in whatever tier it found itself in. And to me, maybe due to bias, that makes me think it's pretty good. It could definitely use a different ability in the place of Rockhead in modern day. Rockhead fits Steelix thematically well, but I think an ability like Intimidate, Heat Proof, Full Metal Body, Solid Rock, Sandstream, Earth Eater, or maybe even Mirror Armor would probably work better. Personally, I like the idea of Levitate, but I realize that's a bit of a stretch. Just give Steelix any of the abilities I just listed and I'll probably shut up. But yeah, that's it. To wrap things up, Steelix wasn't included in Generation 9, so I'm just not going to talk about those games, which is probably for the best since I have a lot of issues with them. I did still enjoy them though, and Orthworm will do for now. I kind of thought I'd have more to talk about, which, considering this video is already this long, is surprising, but Gen 6 and afterward just kind of had the same things going on. And hey, at least Steelix has stayed usable in a tier for every generation. 200 base defense really just is that good. In the new game they announced a bit ago, Pokemon Legends Z through A, they showed an Onix in the trailer, so I think I'm good to lock in Steelix making a return along with Mega Steelix, since they teased Megas coming back. Oh, and I guess I'll just flash a couple things on screen that I forgot I wanted to mention. I mentioned I have every TCG card of Steelix they made, so really quick, this one is my favorite, this one is the most expensive one I have, and this one is my least favorite. Okay, that's it for real this time. Thanks for watching.